Hey everyone, Sean Devine with Douglas Elliman. Today we're going to talk about the three major real estate property types in New York City: co-ops, condos, and townhouses. There are lots of differences between them. They are super important, and once you understand them, it'll get you very far along the way, whether you're looking to buy and you're trying to figure out which of the property types work best for you, or you're looking to sell and figure out who's the likely buyer for this property type, how do we market to them, how do we get their attention, and how do we ultimately get them to the closing table. Starting with co-ops. Co-ops are by far the largest property type in the city. They're about 25 to 30% more affordable than condos. There are certain price points in which co-ops are really going to be the only game in town. Jumping into it, one of the most important things that people think about is rentability. For renting, you're really only probably going to be able to rent for 1 or 2 years after living in the property for 1 or 2 years. You might get a refresh on that ability, meaning that you might be able to rent it out for 2 out of every 5 years or 3 out of every 5 years. That is not necessarily the worst thing in the world, the rentability restriction, because it does mean that you're living with other owners for the most part. Other things to keep in mind for co-ops is that the closing costs are going to be a little bit lower for them than they are for condos and townhouses. Also, other restrictions, in addition to rentability, there might be restrictions on whether you can use the property as a pied-à-terre. There might be restrictions on whether a parent can buy with or for their child. There might be restrictions on whether you can receive a gift for the purchase. There might be restrictions on whether and what type of pet you can have. For co-ops, you usually are going to have to buy it as yourself, as an actual human. You're usually not going to be able to buy it as an entity. That said, with all these restrictions, don't assume that you can't do these things in co-ops. Sometimes you can. So, either look into it yourself or ask your agent to look into it. The most important thing about co-ops is there are financial restrictions to who can buy them. They're not super intuitive, but once you understand the restrictions, it's actually pretty easy and straightforward. First thing you want to figure out, what is the percentage of the purchase price that this building is going to require you to put down? Most co-ops are going to require that you put down at least 20%. There are definitely buildings in the city that require you to put 50% or more down. Figure out, again, ask your agent, how much do I have to put down here? Second concept for a co-op that's super important is called post-closing liquidity. It's really just a multiple of the mortgage and the maintenance payment that you'll make every month. You'll need to have 24 months of mortgage and maintenance somewhere liquid after the closing. You'll have to show that you'll have this after you put down the amount you have to put down, the percentage required in the building. You'll have to also show, after doing that, I'll still have 24 months of mortgage and maintenance, not necessarily in the bank, but somewhere liquid after I close. And the final financial restriction for co-ops, most buildings in the city, if you're at 25% debt to income ratio, you're going to be fine. Certainly if you're below that, you're definitely fine. But in many buildings, you can go up to about 30%. What is the debt to income ratio? Debt to income ratio means every debt that you have to pay every single month, and again, have to pay, not choose to pay. You do have debt no matter what. Even if you come into it with no debt, you will always have the maintenance payment, and if you're taking out a mortgage, you'll always have that mortgage payment. Both of those are always going to be considered debt. That's on the top of the fraction. At the bottom of the fraction, it's much simpler. It's just what's your yearly income before taxes divided by 12. So you divide debt by that gross monthly income. Whatever that number is your debt to income ratio. Keep in mind that for co-ops, you're going to have to fill out what's called a purchase application. It's going to be a bit of a process. Your agent is certainly going to help you a lot through this process. You're going to provide lots of financial paperwork in this application. It's going to give a great snapshot to the co-op board of who you are financially, and this is going to be how they figure out whether you satisfy these financial requirements. It's probably going to take about 3 to 5 weeks from the time that you finalize and submit your purchase application for a co-op for the board to review it and be in touch with you about setting up the co-op board interview. Assuming the interview goes well, you're going to be accepted. Usually you'll find out that you were accepted about a day or two after the interview has taken place. In terms of the overall process, from the time you sign a contract, it usually takes about 2 to 3 months to close on a property that is a co-op in the city. Final thing to talk about for co-ops, the co-op actually is a corporation. It means everybody in the building owns shares for this corporation. The shares that they own allow them to sign a proprietary lease. The proprietary lease gives them access to a specific apartment. This is in large part why they can be significantly more restrictive in who can buy these properties and what can be done with them once they're purchased. Because what you're actually buying is stock. You're not buying real property. Moving on to condos, significantly less restrictive than co-ops. For the most part, that means all the restrictions we just talked about for co-ops really don't exist. So for a condo, you are usually able to rent it out pretty much immediately. There's not much restrictions in terms of when you can rent it out, for how long you can rent it out. So usually you have to rent it out. If you choose to rent it out, it needs to be for at least 6 months. Many buildings will say it needs to be for at least a year. There are buildings in the city that allow you to rent for as little as 1 month at a time, but those are very few and far between. Restrictions for pets, there certainly could be. They're a little bit less likely to exist in a condo than they are in a co-op. Again, if you have a pet, make sure that the building does allow it. I'd say the most common restrictions are probably you're going to be allowed to have a dog or a cat, but there might be restrictions in, again, how many you have, the weight of those pets, and certainly the breed. It can be difficult to have an aggressive breed in an apartment building in the city. Again, restrictions on who can buy them financially, very few restrictions for condos. So in terms of the restrictions that could exist, might be a percent minimum that the building does require down, but usually it's 10%. Or post-closing liquidity, if you're working with a bank, they probably will have a post-closing liquidity requirement, and that usually is 6 months. And if you're buying all cash, there is no post-closing liquidity requirement at all because there's no bank involved. And debt-to-income requirements really depends, again, are you using a bank? If you're not using a bank, there is no debt-to-income requirement. If you are using a bank, most banks, it's probably going to be that they're going to want you to have 43% debt-to-income ratio or less, but that is a significantly larger amount that you can leverage against your income than is the case in the huge majority of co-ops. So, we talked about the co-op application process before. You're not avoiding that process altogether when you're buying in a condo. In a condo, there's still going to be a purchase application, though the process is a little bit different. In a condo, you're submitting a purchase application. There's a lot of the financial paperwork that you had to provide for co-ops is actually pretty similar for a condo. It's going to probably still take about the same amount of time, probably going to take 3 to 5 weeks for the board to review the application and say what they're going to do with it. Much less likely for a condo that there's going to be a board interview, but they do need to issue what's called the waiver of the right of first refusal. Similar to co-ops, it's probably going to take you between 2 and 3 months after signing your contract, getting a fully executed contract, to close on a condo in New York City. By the way, this purchase application process that exists for co-ops, for condos, does not exist in the next property type. Finally, townhouses. Townhouses, if you have been concerned about any of the restrictions of co-ops, of condos, townhouses are the answer to your problems. They are not an inexpensive answer to your problems. There are significantly fewer townhouses than there are of any other property type. In terms of financial restrictions, townhouses, you pretty much have them stripped down to zero. The only restrictions for a townhouse is going to be if you're using a bank, whatever that bank's restrictions are. So some banks, I've definitely seen banks willing to lend where you're only putting 5% down and you're borrowing 95% of the property price. I've seen banks willing to do less than that, so that you might be putting down even less than 5%, especially in the case of a first-time home buyer. That's going to really depend on the price point. You're not going to necessarily be able to buy a $5 or $6 million house and put down 3.5–4%. Talk to your bank, maybe you can, but that's going to be the restriction. Again, no post-closing liquidity requirement, no debt-to-income ratio requirement, unless you're working with a bank and the bank has those specific restrictions in place. And rentability, things like that, whether you do construction, who you're applying to, the restrictions in a townhouse, very few and far between. You want to wash your dryer, put in a washer dryer, you're not asking somebody else. You want to change around the layout. The only real restrictions for a townhouse are laws, what banks will allow you to do, and you probably will have to file with the Department of Buildings. And in terms of neighbors, it's really just whoever's on your block. I mean, it's your house, you're going to be on your own. It might be that you bought a multi-unit building and then you're choosing to rent out some of those units, but you're choosing who's living with you. So it's very different than in a building with a co-op or a condo. I hope that explanation of the differences between co-ops, condos, and townhouses makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions, and otherwise have a great day. Bye.